Hey everyone, good afternoon. It's Emily and the THEC team. We're going to wait 1 or 2 more minutes to make sure everyone is able to join us as in the format that they're supposed to be joining, rather like than an attendee for some people as a presenter, etc. So we'll work on that on our end, and then we will get started in about 2 minutes. Hey everybody, thanks for your patience. We're getting some texts and some emails that a few folks are having a challenge joining the call, so we'll just give it another minute or two so we can fix that up. Thank you all so much.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. We'll be having some people join onto this call as we figure out the technical issues right now, but right now it looks like we have a quorum to proceed, and we'll detect that in a second when Crystal calls the roll. For those who are joining in by phone, you are muted until you dial *6. When you dial *6, you'll be able to speak. For all those who are watching in or who are watching in and on the panel as a committee member, you can raise your hand in the emoji icons below, and we'll see that, and we'll call on you should you have any comments or questions. Right now, we're going to start off with calling the roll and then having a statement of necessity to meet virtually. Crystal?
Thank you, Dr. Gentile. When I call your name, if you could just indicate that you're on the call, that would be very helpful. Emily House,
Here.
Executive Director, Tennessee Higher Ed.
Right here.
Also, if you are acting as a designee for the member that I mentioned, please answer for that person and let us know that you are acting as the designee. Randy Boyd, University of Tennessee President.
This is David Miller here for Randy Boyd.
Thank you, David. Flora Tidings, Tennessee Board of Regents Chancellor.
Yes, this is Danny Gibbs in for Chancellor Tidings.
Thank you, Danny. Michael Licari, Austin Peay State University President.
Yes, present here.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Dr. Licari.
Sorry.
Brian Nolan, East Tennessee State University President.
Here.
Thank you, President Nolan. Sydney McPhee, Middle Tennessee State University President. Glenda Glover, Tennessee State University President.
Present.
Thank you, ma'am. Phil Oldham, Tennessee Tech University President. David Rudd, University of Memphis President. Butch Ely, Department of Finance and Administration Commissioner.
This is Greg Turner for Commissioner Ely.
Thank you, Greg. Jason Mumpower, Comptroller.
This is Lauren Spires for Comptroller Manpower.
Thank you, Lauren. Senator Brian Kelsey, Chair, Senate Education Committee.
This is Michael Marin here for Senator Brian Kelsey.
Thank you, Michael. Senator Bo Watson, Chair, Senate Finance, Ways and Means.
John Kerr for Senator Watson.
Thank you, John. Representative Mark White, Chair, House Education. Representative Patsy Hazelwood, Chair, House Finance, Ways and Means. Jessica Himes, House Budget Analysis Director. Catherine Hare, Senate Budget Analysis Director.
Dr. McPhee, were you able to join us? We thought we saw you earlier online.
Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That's 10 people. That is a quorum.
Okay, great. All right. Again, thanks for your patience as we navigate some of these technical issues. If other folks are able to join us as we go on, we'll just make sure we know that they are here. Stephen.
And now I need to read a statement of necessity for convening this virtually. Committee members, as you may have determined from the introductions, we do not have a quorum that is physically present here in the TEC Buccaneers conference room. As such, Tennessee Code annotated 844-108B2 requires that the committee make a determination that a necessity exists in order for a quorum of members to participate by electronic or other means of communication. A necessity means that the matters to be considered by a public body at a meeting requiring timely action by the body, that physical presence by a quorum of the members is not practical within the period of time requiring action, and that participation by a quorum of the members by electronic or other means of communication is necessary. In this case, 3 facts support a determination of necessity. First, pursuant to TCA 497202G, the committee is required to serve as a review committee to aid in the development of the funding formula. Second, the commission is scheduled to meet in the fall, and any staff recommendation to the commission as reviewed by the committee must be sent to the commission members in a timely manner in advance of that meeting. Third, scheduling conflicts and other commitments prevented most members from being physically present today. Is there a motion to move forward?
This is Greg Turner. I make the motion. I move that based on the summary provided by Dr. Gentile, a necessity exists for members to participate electronically, and that the adoption of this motion and Dr. Gentile's recitation of the facts and circumstances on which the determination of necessity is based be included in the minutes of this meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Turner. Is there a second?
This is Brian Nolan, second.
Thank you. Crystal, please read the roll.
Emily House.
Aye.
David Miller.
Aye.
Danny Gibbs.
Aye.
President Licari.
Aye.
President Nolan,
Aye.
President McPhee, Pre-
President Fisher, you can't hear him. He's trying to speak, but no one can hear him.
Okay. He's trying to speak, but no one can hear him.
Okay, great. Thank you. President Glover.
Aye.
Thank you. President Oldham.
Aye.
Thank you, sir. Raj Karapati. Greg Turner.
Aye.
Thank you, sir. Lauren Spires.
Aye.
Thank you. Michael Marin.
Aye.
Thank you. John Kerr.
Aye.
That's 12 ayes.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Crystal.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. We'll move on to talking about the rest of this agenda and recap what happened on July 8th, our first formal review commission meeting. This agenda today, we're going to talk about 3 different items. The first is going to be about graduation rate on the university sector, or graduation rate overall. Then talk about fixed costs and talk about workforce training in the community college sector. A review of the July 8th committee meeting. We first started off by talking about the purpose of this formal review commission as rooted in statute and what guides us in the charges and responsibilities therein. We recommended immediate changes to the university associate degree outcome to be implemented for this immediate cycle, the appropriation request that's guiding our November recommendation to our commission. We presented those changes for the associate degree rescaling and a focus on those associate degree recipients in the university sector who stop out immediately. We recommended that to our commission in July, and they approved those changes. We also discussed changes for the next 5-year cycle to inform our recommendation, not for this November, but for the next November 2022, ultimately for the fiscal year 23-24 appropriation cycle. We discussed the workforce investment premium, which would be a new focus population to incentivize the completion of degrees and certificates in the undergraduate population in areas that correspond to the needs of the state. And there appeared to be broad agreement on this inclusion. We also recommended expanding the data collection process to include out-of-state students in the low-income focus population premium to align with all other focus population premium calculations. This would require collection of a new data source, which we have identified, and there was broad agreement on that inclusion as well. Finally, we had a lengthy discussion about potentially changing the 6-year graduation rate measure in the outcomes funding formula to a 4-year graduation rate, in part to allow for more growth in our efficiency metric in the university sector, but also to incentivize on-time completion, I should say policies and practices that encourage more on-time completion. As a reminder, with this metric and all metrics, we are detecting success in the outcomes funding formula by measuring how well an institution performs on a certain outcome in comparison to its base self. So with looking at the graduation rate, 6-year graduation rate right now, and the conversation about a 4-year graduation rate, the proposal is to recognize, say, how institution A compares on that rate, not in comparison to all other institutions, but into how it performed from prior years. And that is how money moves in the formula. All that said, we received direct feedback in the July 8 meeting and since with a concern about how the 4-year graduation rate would impact institutions that serve more Pell-eligible student bodies or more student bodies that have a greater composition of racial and ethnic minorities. And the committee requested TX staff to provide at the next meeting, so this meeting, an analysis of these populations with regards to a 4-year rate. And we will speak to this today. With this meeting, we anticipate reviewing all the recommendations that we have for the next 5-year review. And should there be no need for a further meeting, we intend to compile these recommendations into a memo that we send out to this committee for feedback before our November commission meeting. Again, this is not to move money for this upcoming cycle, but for the next one. With that said, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. House for opening remarks.
All right. Hey, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. Principals and designees, thank you for being here, and thank you for bearing with us as we navigate the perils of WebEx. I want to double back on something that Dr. Gentile just said and just clarify something before we even start. At the request of the committee, the fiscal team, Russell, Crystal, and Stephen have done some excellent analysis of four-year graduation rates by different subgroups of students. Stephen just said this was per our discussion on July 8th. So you will see those data presented by Russell in just a couple minutes. What I want to say to the committee, though, is that we have heard and received and heard all of the feedback around many concerns related to this metric. We have received the letters, we have received the emails, we understand where the concerns are around this metric. While everyone is, of course, welcome to give their perspective on this today, there is no need to rehash any of that, time permitting. We will include that correspondence in the minutes of this meeting. But as we begin this conversation, the THEC team does not intend to recommend a four-year graduation rate as a proposed change to our commission in November. So while we are having this discussion, we have heard the feedback loud and clear, which pretty much, to be honest, ranged from pretty agnostic to very, very much against. We have heard this feedback, and we are not going to propose this to our commission. Okay, just to be very clear about that. We are going to hear about the data at the committee's request, and Russell has done some really great work, so we are going to hear that. However, just so everyone is on the same page, this is not the end of this conversation by any means. We are going to continue thinking about efficiency, thinking about the commitments that have been made to student success and student outcomes verbally, in practice, in this correspondence related to this particular issue. Everyone is very committed to student success and efficient completion, and no one is debating that. How we talk about that, how we think about that, if there is a point in time in which we discuss that in the bounds of the funding formula, will remain a conversation. So we on the THEC side are thinking over the next few years about another round of revisions to our master plan, closing in on 2025, the strategic financial plan that Dr. Gentile leads, and before we know it, we will be having these conversations again about the funding formula. So as we think about efficiency metrics and graduation rates and all of these things, this is the beginning of this discussion, even though we are not going to propose a four-year graduation rate change to our commission in November. So I just want to be very, very clear about that this does not render moot any of this analysis or this discussion. This is just not something that we are going to pursue because, again, we have heard everyone's feedback in this regard. So I just wanted to set the stage with that preamble, and with that, I will hand it over to Russell to present on his analysis, unless Dr. Gentile, you have something else to say.
No,
okay.
Thank you, Dr.
Again,
House.
thank you all for being here, and I'll hand it over to Russell.
All right. Mind moving us forward. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for having me. As Dr. House just said, we are not planning on moving forward with the recommendation to our commission on transitioning to an on-time graduation rate. That said, we have had a robust discussion here. I appreciate all the feedback you all have given us. And I do want to take some time to answer some questions that came up during the last meeting, both about the graduation rates themselves and about growth within those graduation rates.
Next slide.
Yeah, actually, I might just have you do it because it's not clicking great. Thanks. As a reminder for where we're at right now, that gray bar is showing our 6-year graduation rates for the most recent cohort available. The blue bar is showing our 4-year graduation rates. The 6-year ranges from about 40% to 80%, the 4-year 16 to 55 or so. Of course, you all know this, but your institutions have unique student bodies, and I think these graduation rates reflect that. So while the data we've shown has suggested that all universities have had greater growth in their 4-year grad rates, there's been concern, understandably, that institutions with greater shares of Pell or minority students may struggle to succeed with something like a 4-year graduation rate within the formula. We're going to talk a little bit about the data we found speaking to this. Great. So I'll answer a few questions we received during the last meeting about the growth for these groups. Specifically, what does graduation rate growth look like for Pell or minority students during the last 6 years that we've had data for this most recent 6-year formula cycle. And just for reference, while I'm talking here, roughly 1 in 4 Pell students and 1 in 2 non-Pell students is graduating on time in our state. So that's overall, that's all university students, that is. This chart shows cumulative growth in graduation rates since the 2009 cohort, the first year for this formula cycle. You can see we have 4 groups here, so Pell and non-Pell students, both at the LGIs and the UT system. Blue generally indicates growth, orange shows a decline. Based on the colors, we can see there's a lot of growth in this chart, and we're proud of that. Looking at 2014 specifically, the most recent year of data that we have available, we can see that the growth is higher cumulatively at the 4-year level than it is at the 6-year level. And that's true for Pell and non-Pell students, right? So across all 4 of those subgroups, the growth is higher at the 4-year level than it is for the 6-year level. In fact, in the university sector overall, Pell and non-Pell graduates have grown their 4-year grad rates at the exact same level, about 11 percentage points over the last 6 years. What this chart tells us is that based on the data from the most recent 6-year formula cycle, the 4-year graduation rate would not have uniquely hurt our Pell eligible students. Next slide. We also have heard concerns about institutions with high levels of minority students having difficulty succeeding under a 4-year metric. And so we wanted to look into this as well. You can see again, cumulative percentage growth, same thing as before. Blue indicates increases, orange slight declines. Again, a lot of blue, so a lot to be proud of here. And keeping in mind as we look through these slides that the proportion of Hispanic and other students in these charts is relatively small, so the data is just a bit more noisy. Even so, we can see that minority students at the LGIs, looking here, are improving their on-time grad rates at a pace that is similar to or in excess of the growth they've shown at the 6-year rates. And a similar story at the UTs, which we'll see on the next slide. Very similar, the 4-year rates have been really impressive. There's growth generally across all groups during this time, and again, especially for those on-time graduation rates. That said, slide on to one more. Yep, thank you. All the data I've shown you has been historical, and as I've shown, our universities have done a wonderful job of improving both on-time and delayed graduation rates for both Pell and minority students. And moreover, we've shown that this growth has been even greater for the 4-year time intervals than the 6-year for all the subgroups we've listed here. This is wonderful news, and we're super excited. We were glad that our analysis showed this. That said, there is still room to improve. Data here show orange for any rate that is less than 50%, so 1 in 2. Roughly 1 in 4 Pell students at the LGIs are graduating on time. Roughly 1 in 3 Pell students at the UT system, which you can see here as well. Looking at this by race on the next slide, we can see a very similar trend. Again, orange is less than 50%. We're seeing a lot of orange on this chart still. Less than 1 in 5 Black students at our LGIs is graduating on time, something like 1 in 3 at our UT system. In the coming months and years, THEC wants to be able to help institutions make improvements so that we are continuing the growth we've shown in the last 5 years for the next 5, 6, however many years it takes to continue improving here. So that's it for my remarks. I'm happy to answer questions. I'll toss it back over to Dr. Gentile.
Yep, I'll actually say something real quick. Thank you, Russell. So again, really exceptional work here by Russell and Crystal and Stephen and the data team, exposing a lot of why this needs to be the beginning of the conversation with this group rather than the end. Of course, at the campus level, at THEC kind of writ large, we're having these conversations all the time. And the commitment to student success, I know, is universal. So really important to put some numbers behind this, and of course, welcome any questions, but just want to again emphasize that this is not a change that we're hoping to make in the formula this go round, but happy to begin the conversation with any comments or questions from the group. And Stephen, I don't know if you had anything else there.
Yeah, I just want to highlight, from some of the correspondence we've received, I know that everyone who's on this call is eager to improve these graduation rates, but part of this conversation that Dr. House is alluding to requires us to look into what are the policies and practices outside of the formula that we need to think through from a state level down to the institutions on improving these rates. And I know that the institutional representatives here have been thinking about that all along, and now it's time to have that state level conversation. Are there any comments or questions about
Yes, President Glover has her hand raised.
President Glover?
Yes, I'd like to know, would it be possible to share the slides, the graph with us, please?
Yes, ma'am, of course.
We'll send this after the meeting.
Also, President Glover, I can actually make it available on our website as well, but I'll be sure to send it to you. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I had a quick question. This is Phil. So I think one of the big drivers behind some of this improvement, particularly the 4-year rate, is the number of credit hours that students come into school with through dual enrollment and other things. I mean, has there been any look at those trends, and if there's a demographic issue related to dual enrollment credits? I mean, if you really want to move this needle, I think dual enrollment is a key.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So I'll speak to that just briefly, and then you can speak to that, Dr. Gentile. We have done a ton of analysis and a ton of thinking around dual enrollment as it relates to time to degree kind of broadly. And to your point, sir, it does expedite time to degree for many students who take dual enrollment courses. We can do a little bit more work piecing that out by demography in a way that could be helpful here. So that's helpful, Stephen.
Yeah, just that we've had many conversations over the last few years, if not the last couple of weeks.
The last 48 hours.
The last 48 hours actually about dual enrollment and what the state has done with the GIVE grant, but then also the expansion of the dual enrollment grants. We're all eager to make sure it's not the same. It's not necessarily improving access just for the students who are going to go to college anyhow, but all students. And so Amanda Clefane and our research and strategy team have a keen interest in doing analysis on dual enrollment, and we'll certainly incorporate this into that conversation.
Yeah, and just let me add, I mean, one aspect of that, which a lot of the dual enrollment is sort of remote, that's available to students across the state, and that's still somewhat problematic, I think. To whatever extent, as a state, we can encourage more embedded dual enrollment credits within the high schools. That is really effective, I think, and probably the best way to address this.
Dr. Oldham, when you say remote, do you mean like in light of COVID, it's done via distance, or it's just, you mean it's not done on the high school campus?
Even, yeah, it's not done on a campus.
Okay.
I mean, we don't have campuses that close by, and even a lot of the community colleges are doing this, by online technologies, which don't always serve a high school population very effectively.
Got it, sir. Thank you. That's very helpful to kind of marry the work that we've done with regard to dual enrollment with this work that we've done too. That's very helpful. Are there other questions or comments before we move on to fixed costs? Thank you, Dr. Glover and Dr. Oldham.
Danny Gibbs.
Yes, I realize this discussion is really focused on the universities at this time. But I think as part of the discussion going forward, and at the appropriate time, TBR would consider allowing community colleges to introduce a graduation rate metric as well into the funding formula. It's really another way to measure our performance and growth over time. To this end, we've had presidents express interest in this particular metric. Of course, they would probably look at a 3-year graduation rate, but I think it's something that would merit discussion at the appropriate time going forward.
Yeah, thank you for the comment, Danny. I think that THEC would be very open to having that conversation with TBR about adding a graduation rate metric to the community college sector as a sector outcome in the future. Absolutely. And we appreciate the fact that that's something that TBR and community colleges have been focusing on specifically over the last few years, is the graduation rate, the 3-year graduation rate for their students. So yeah, we welcome that conversation.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else have a question or a comment? Okay, thank you again to Russell. We can move on to fixed costs. Kind of taken over your meeting, Stephen. I'm sorry.
No, you're on the committee. So.
I am okay.
All right, so fixed costs. I presaged this conversation last meeting on the the realm of what we might talk about during this meeting and why we want to address it. I like to have a broader conversation and then go in depth into what we'd like to recommend with regards to fixed costs. First of all, a fixed cost overview, the review of fixed costs. Right now, the formula comprises more than just outcomes. It also has fixed costs embedded into it, and it comprises about 22% of the overall formula. In other words, when we think about what influences who gets what in the appropriations, it's important to note that fixed costs is about a fifth to a quarter in total. Fixed costs are, it's been in the model since before we had the outcomes model, going back to the enrollment-based model, going back decades. And it measures several things. First of all, the overall campus footprint, and specifically the space that is dedicated to education and general square footage. It does include things such as all of your office buildings, your biology buildings, etc. Anything that's dedicated, again, to that academic enterprise. We also have in that formula a premium that we give to space that's not been renovated in the last 20 years, or essentially older space that's not been touched in modern day renovations. So any biology building, office building, etc., that's over 20 years old will be worth more in the formula. We have a utility estimate, and this is an efficiency-based estimate, ultimately based on the overall size of your E&G square footage. We recognize 10% of your equipment inventory. That helps as that changes, that moves money. And then we have rental space, which is not a large part of what we see at our institutions, but rental space is included in our fixed cost. This is an annual calculation, and I want to contrast that with how the rest of the formula works. The outcomes used in the formula is based on the 3-year average. With regards to fixed cost, we just look at a snapshot of usage from one year to the next. There's no 3-year average, no volatility tampering therein. And because of that, the fixed costs are highly sensitive to new buildings, demolitions, renovations. Anytime a campus decides to take a building offline is unneeded in 1 year, that would lower appropriations. And again, there's no 3-year average to that. This is not why we're bringing this up, but I think it's an important note. With regards to the institutions, the systems, and THEC itself, this is the most time-intensive portion of the formula. It is self-reported, and so therefore requires close scrutiny by TX staff and lots of back and forth conversations with institutional staff to make sure, the system staff, make sure that what we're putting in the formula is accurate with regards to fixed cost. Next slide, please. So why are we talking about this today? First of all, the outcomes formula statute enumerated in 497202F does not list physical space as an outcome to be measured. However, because our outcomes funding formula encourages growth, the inclusion of fixed cost simply encourages growth in fixed cost to move money. And in that sense, right now, fixed cost only trails associate and bachelor degrees for influence over state appropriation. Because of that encouragement of growth, it includes it incentivizes campuses to expand the campus footprint. And what I would say is more importantly, it disincentivizes reducing the campus footprint. We'll talk more about that later on. And this is important because our current capital process in which we prioritize for capital outlay for the last 5 years since Focus has had a strong criteria related to how well and efficient you are with your space that you have. Is the space in good condition? Are you maximizing space utilization? Are you reducing unneeded space with the new capital outlay project? So our capital policy works in disjointment with our overall appropriation process. And we have had over the years a number of institutions wanting us to revisit fixed cost and its influence in the model. Next slide. Looking over the last 10 years and how fixed costs have changed, there are reasons for increase in fixed cost institutions and reasons for decrease in fixed costs and associated appropriations. The increases make sense. National State, Northeast, Motlow, Volunteer, they've had new buildings come online in the last 10 years, and therefore their appropriations have increased. Related to Volunteer State, TTU once received state appropriations for the fixed costs associated with the Cookeville Higher Education Center. that has since transferred on from Volunteer State via Nashville State. And so Volunteer State now receives a greater share of appropriations due to that transfer. About 6 years ago, UT Chattanooga acquired a couple of office buildings that were right adjacent to the building, and they use it for their E&G enterprise. That led to an increase in appropriations for UT Chattanooga. Again, that makes sense. But where there have been decreases in appropriations, several universities over the last 5 years have utilized more efficient space use of their traditional E&G space. So a biology building is going to have all the biology courses rather than spread out into auxiliary space across campus, E&G classroom space. And that's because that's counter to what our fixed costs incentivize. Our fixed costs incentivize taking up as much space as possible with classrooms. Second, Chattanooga State, when they demolished buildings several years back, they lost appropriations. Cleveland State, up until this year, has not had new space in the lifetime of this formula, really in the last 3 decades. They have ceded appropriations onto other institutions that have grown in space. And finally, I mentioned earlier, new buildings at Northeast State led to a growth in appropriations. They have since had demolitions in other space on that campus that have reversed that growth in appropriations brought on. So the big takeaway here, next slide, is that the current fixed cost structure encourages an arms race on space because the outcomes model rightfully encourages growth in generally. That said, the state and THEC, through its processes for capital, have greatly called on efficiency in capital space. And as I just mentioned in the previous slide, institutions that have practiced capital policies in alignment with what the state is encouraging has lost funding relatively over the years. This year, we've got 2 capital processes running, one's for renovated space and one's for new space. But I think the fact that we're focusing on renovated space with the spotlight right now highlights what we think about as far as capital going forward, is where buildings should be renovated before new space is brought on. And again, when that's done in our formula, when you renovate space, you lose that premium and you lose appropriations. So we have several recommendations to recommend for conversation here today. Next slide. First, due to the overall complexity of the fixed cost, we recommend streamlining the measure to remove items that we feel go against state capital policy, like the non-renovated premium, and to remove other things that have little influence on fixed costs, but again, do take up system time, institution time, and THEC time, like rent and utilities, and instead focus squarely on E&G footprint and the equipment inventory. Second, in alignment with our outcomes funding formula, and to limit volatility from any one change in building demolition, as an example, or renovation, move the fixed cost measure from a 1-year snapshot of data to a 3-year average. And then third, gradually reduce, but not remove, over 3 formula cycles, the influence of fixed costs on the formula. And I'm talking about that 22%, reducing that down over some time. This is different from what we first brought forward to the working committee and had conversations with the principals on this phone call, where we were recommending over a 3 to 5 year period, phasing out, not just reducing fixed costs. Instead, we think this 3-fold approach would recognize the fixed cost needs on campus, but not have it be such an influential measure in the formula to incentivize behavior. With that said, I welcome any comments, questions, discussion on these recommendations, any one of them.
Thanks, Stephen. Does anyone have a comment or a question related to fixed costs?
This is Phil. So I'm just curious, has there been any modeling on this to know how it would move money?
There's been modeling on focusing squarely on E&G footprint and modeling on reducing over several metrics, like down to 15%, 10%, 0% on the formula. We've shared that out, and we'll be happy to share that out after this meeting. We have not shared out modeling on the 3-year average snapshot of volatility, but we anticipate the tampering down of that. What we've seen, go ahead. President Olin?
I was just going to say, just on its face, I mean, it seems reasonable to me, but without seeing how, it's likely to move things, it's hard to know.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, we can share that out again, sir, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. The cautionary tape that I put on sharing out those models is it's capturing how fixed costs have changed retrospectively, not going forward. So the movements you see, there are a couple things that actually come through in this. The movements you see are the movements I talked about a couple slides back about what we've seen in buildings coming online, offline, demolition. Your campus may not have those demolitions coming online or et cetera going forward, so you might experience something different. Second, another thing that this does, this change will do, is it, especially I'd say the limiting of volatility and the reduction, is that it does play into a more influence of outcomes in the formula over fixed costs. So if in the last 5 years you've performed very well in the formula, fixed costs were a buffer before like seeing more growth, versus if you perform not as well in the last 5 years, fixed costs served as a buffer. I say that because this is retrospectively speaking. If you anticipate success in your outcomes going forward, it would be a different story in that modeling. David Miller?
Similarly, I was thinking not even about the shift between institutions, but if the modeling could include, would it result in decreasing overall funding, period? Mm-hmm. And it seems like that model would be important as well, in addition to how it would shift funding.
Okay.
No.
So, David, thank you for that question. Interestingly, the model that we created looks at how funding would have moved if there were no new money. And that's mostly so that any money that is added into the system doesn't mute or increase the cumulative impact. We wanted to see what the impact would be just in base appropriations. We could probably put together a model that maybe looked specifically at 21-22. What would the change in fixed costs have done to the recommendation in the most recent year? It's a little more difficult to do it all the way back because of the additive nature, although we probably could, it just would take more time. But the modeling that we've shared out previously always started with a base of no new appropriations.
Thanks.
Danny Gibbs.
Danny?
Yes, thanks, Stephen. And, first of all, I guess I want to thank you and Crystal for, a lot of time that you all have spent discussing this particular item with us. And of course, I mean, there's a lot of pros and cons either way, really, with making any type of adjustments with this particular line item. I think from our perspective, it's always, been our assumption that really the original wisdom for the inclusion of the fixed asset component in the funding formula was, of course, primarily to recognize the significant operating cost, associated with bringing new buildings online, and to help support, the cost of maintaining those buildings. And, I kind of think, 10 to 12 years later, that, original premise, there being significant cost associated with bringing these buildings online, is still really, really very true. So I'm glad to see that you're not considering, eliminating this altogether. Several of our schools, do believe that it's important to keep the fixed cost component there, where in theory, there would be some appropriation increase either in or near the year that a new building is down. And again, I think to some of our schools that was particularly important. Just kind of thinking through this a little bit and thinking out loud based on some of our discussions and so forth. I mean, I think it may make some sense. Again, we might want to see a little bit more modeling, but it may make some sense to limit this to the E&G space component, kind of as you've described here today, and especially removing the premium, for the older unrenovated space. Really, I mean, that's not a factor in any of our decisions whether to renovate or not, but we would agree with the idea that, schools shouldn't be penalized when they renovate space. Thinking about the 3-year rolling average portion, I think there we're probably concerned that using the 3-year rolling average would really dilute probably one of the primary benefits that we see of fixed costs being included in the formula to begin with. And that's, again, to provide really a current revenue stream that would be available to help fund the immediate cost of bringing a new building online. Really, currently, this is probably the only component of the formula where one, really can see an immediate impact when something changes. The rates, whether it's 22%, 15%, I certainly think that would, be open to discussion. I mean, we have no reason really to believe that the current allocation is not appropriate. But honestly, I don't know that we've dug in deep enough really to determine what maybe our rate percentage should be. Is it 22%? Is it 15%? But I think that's something that, we would certainly be open to looking at. So, I think also, I guess for us, a related concern, and you had mentioned it, is that any movement really to increase the impact of the outcomes on the formula, we think will be detrimental to the community colleges over the next several years, given that, because of an act of God and really through no fault of our own, our outcomes will more than likely decline significantly over the next few years because of the pandemic and the resulting significant enrollment declines that our sector has experienced last year, and we're experiencing it again this year. So really, this is of the utmost concern to us. You're right, it brings more of the appropriation back into play based on the outcomes in a time where, again, we've taken a hit with something that's beyond our control. It's not a state policy decision. It's nothing that we have done, but yet we're going to pay the price for it, we're afraid, over the next few years. So, I think that is something also that should be considered, whether it's part of this fixed cost recommendation or some other measure to remediate the impact of that, perhaps on our system.
Okay, Danny, thank you for that. And I'm grateful that you went bullet point by bullet point, because those are broken up here purposefully for us to have a robust conversation on any one of these. So as I think in summary, what you stated, the streamlining the measure seems appropriate. Limiting volatility kind of takes the oomph out of the reason for fixed cost. And then reducing fixed costs influence on the formula. There might be a better rate. We might be fine now. And at the same time, y'all are concerned about the pandemic's impact on outcomes via enrollment, and that reduction here would highlight that decline in outcomes.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's all helpful, Danny. Thank you.
Lauren Spires?
Yes. So will the commission be voting on each of these separately, or are they going to be taking it up as like a lump item? Like, can they pick and choose to approve one or more of these?
Well, so the commission meeting is not until November. Between now and then, we are going to engage in conversations, not in the meeting format, but in memos, forms with the members to solicit feedback. We've yet to decide on what we'll formally put like this in front of the commissioners. But historically, the commission does have full authority over this. If they wanted to pick and choose a sentence to change here or there over the recommendations, they certainly may. That's their authority to do so. Lauren, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Are there any other?
Anyone who's raised a hand?
No one wants to raise a hand? Okay. Well, again, we look forward to hearing from you on the feedback to these measures here, these recommendations. And of course, email any one of the three of us, Russell, Crystal, myself, or Dr. House, about the fixed cost recommendations. Moving on to workforce training and our Senior Director of Fiscal Policy, Crystal Collins.
Thank you, Dr. Gentile. And I just want to reiterate, thank you all for joining us, and appreciate that there are some people who are on the call who are still unable to get through their technical difficulties, and we'll reach out to you after the meeting to make sure you're able to provide any comment back to us. And if we're able, we'll include that in our minutes. So thank you. Our final discussion topic for today addresses an outcome metric in the community college sector, and that is our workforce training outcome. Unlike the workforce investment premium that we talked about in July, which was focusing on the partnership between majors, what students were majoring in, and what workforce was looking for, this is the workforce training metric is a non-credit contact hour measure. And what this is activities and programs where community colleges are partnering with local businesses, industry partners, or other community members to provide training and other upskilling for local community members. These activities do not lead to credit attributable towards a degree, but they do increase occupational, technical, and/or soft skills within the workforce. They can also lead, in some cases, to an occupational or technical non-academic certificate. So think certificate in Microsoft Office software or a certificate in phlebotomy. The programs and activities included in the annual workforce training report fall into two main categories. Those offered through contracts with local community partners and businesses. An example of this would be the fact that Chattanooga State has partnered with the Volkswagen assembly plant, and they're in Chattanooga to provide all orientation and training activities for employees at that plant. So that is a contract that Chattanooga State has with Volkswagen. And there are also activities that are open to anyone in the community. An example of this would be at Cleveland State, where they offer small business fundamentals to local business owners to teach them how to leverage microloans or other things related to business. Since the formula was created in 2010, the workforce training metric has evolved and grown significantly. 5 years ago, the community college sector reported about 500,000 clock hours of workforce training. Last year in 1920, that number had grown to nearly 950,000. So an almost doubling in the last 5 years of these activities. Workforce training remains the only completely self-reported metric in the funding formula, and THEC works closely with the Tennessee Board of Regents each year to review and update when needed the definition that we provide to the community colleges that outlines how the submission of this report should be made to THEC. And that definitional document mostly identifies 4 questions that an institution should ask about whether or not the activity that they're reporting meets the requirements of workforce training. And then it will also list things that maybe meet those 4 questions but should be excluded. So the questions aren't exhaustive. There are only 4 of them. And so a lot of times institutions may be participating in an activity that doesn't meet the overall definition for workforce training. During this review, THEC will often ask follow-up questions about the activities included in the workforce training report. And over the years, those questions and follow-up discussions have resulted in small refinements to that document that either add new activities approved for the report or identify submitted activities that should be removed because the definitions said that they should. Occasionally, this process has highlighted information about previously approved activities that require additional review and discussion about whether those activities meet the intention of the workforce training metric. And that's what we're going to be discussing today. While THEC intends to have a broader policy conversation, sort of similar to our on-time graduation discussion earlier, while we intend to have a broader conversation over the next several years about how best to recognize successful partnerships between community colleges and local businesses, in the meantime, we believe that there are 2 current concerns that require immediate action in this 5-year review cycle. So first, THEC staff are concerned with the inclusion of some activities provided through partnerships between the reporting community college and third-party firms. During the review process last year, THEC staff learned that activities reported by community colleges through partnerships with the online education provider Ed2Go. Ed2Go is a national online continuing education provider. That those activities do not actually utilize any instructional faculty or staff members or any instructional materials from the community college providing those courses, reporting those hours. In fact, those instructional materials and the instructors themselves are identified and provided by Ed2Go and not the community college. Additionally, in most cases, the community college's role for those activities are limited to advertising that the courses exist, collecting fees from the students who sign up and participate, and then monitoring those students' progress, and then report that information back to Ed2Go. TX staff believe that these activities in which institutions are not involved in the development of course materials or course design and are not involved in the delivery of that course material should no longer influence funding distribution in the funding formula going forward. Another concern is the reporting of the independent instructional activity provided by individuals who received their training from the community college who are reporting hours. This one's a little bit more complicated than the Ed2Go conversation. So community colleges currently are including training provided to individuals that result in those individuals achieving trainer status in a given field. As an example, a person can enroll in a training course that once they complete, they achieve a certification as an OSHA outreach trainer. So that person has been trained to then go out and provide OSHA training to other people. Those outreach trainers go out into the greater world, provide training to others, but do not receive additional instructional assistance or necessarily any direction for where those trainings should be provided by the community college that trained them in the first place. Both sets of these activities, the primary training of the trainer and the secondary work of that trainer out in the greater community, are currently being reported in the workforce training report. While we believe that the primary activities do meet the requirements for workforce training, TX staff believe that these secondary trainer provided hours do not and should no longer influence funding distribution in the formula. So, based on the analysis completed by our staff and taking into account policy and feedback that we've received by various stakeholders, including members on the call today and our working group members over the last several months, we're recommending the following proposed change. First, exclude activities provided by the third-party vendor Ed2Go, and further exclude activities independently provided by trainers who received their training from the reporting community college. So again, excluding activities provided by the third-party vendor Ed2Go, and also excluding those secondary trainer-provided hours reported by the community college who trained the trainer. We're proposing to implement this change by requesting revised workforce training reports from the community colleges that would identify these hours, so those hours could be removed from the base, and those institutions could be gauged in growth based on the hours that remain in the definition. And this can be accomplished mechanically in a manner that meets our guiding principles. And that is the recommended change for workforce training. Are there any comments or questions from the committee about this recommendation? Danny?
Thank you, Crystal. And again, on this one, thank you, Stephen, for taking a lot of time to explain this one to us. I do want to, I guess, provide some comments and perspective to it. We'll take maybe Ed to go first. As you're aware, I mean, our colleges have offered Ed2Go courses as really a cost-effective way to deliver training and professional development to the communities that they serve. Through Ed2Go, the colleges, they can offer an extensive catalog of relevant and current courses, very good inventory of courses. But often the enrollment in any given course is very low, to the point that it would be cost prohibitive for a college to develop and offer the courses on their own. So instead, as you're aware, I mean, their model has been to partner with the private sector on these to offer these courses. And really by removing these courses from the formula calculation, it appears to our campuses that really their efforts to make the training available to their communities at a cost lower than they would have to charge to develop and offer the same courses themselves really is not being valued by removing this particular method from the formula. And instead, really, they see it as almost being punished for partnering to make the opportunities available and keeping the cost more affordable for the students. And, you know, I know that, you know, you are focusing on who develops materials and how the materials are delivered and taught to the students. But really, I think at the end of the day, you know, what we're trying to award is outcomes, not really how we got there, not who's teaching it or who developed the materials. They're just using a more creative way to go about doing that here. And really the only way probably that they can. I mean, otherwise, I just don't think they'll be able to offer the breadth of offerings that they are doing now. You know, and this is, I think, definitely the sentiment of our campuses. As you're aware, some of them have provided basically testimonials to that effect. And you know, just to kind of confirm what I've said, I actually just want to, if I could, read a few of those, you know, that the colleges submitted. I mean, they have said that we cannot operate classes with 1 or 2 students. This platform and other platforms like it allow us to provide folks in the community with the opportunity to earn credentials and training that they might not otherwise have access to. Another says that by partnering with a provider that already has established curriculum and LMS systems in place, it provides us with an opportunity to serve the lone individual in our service area interested in C++ certification, or better yet, the 5 interested individuals with schedules that do not allow them to be all in the same place at the same time. Another states that if THEC were to remove online course offerings from reportable contact hours, it would be a detriment to our faculty to help our community, it'd be a detriment to our ability to help our communities. Many of these programs have been approved for WHEEL funding. If these courses are no longer provided us with contact hours, our attention would be pulled from helping individuals enroll and find the courses that was right for them to focus on items that will feed into the funding formula. And finally, one last one, shouldn't the priority of any department within a community college or government entity be to help the community? This is a way we have found to help our communities with the resources available to us. Ed2Go services have been vetted by us and many other colleges and universities across the country. So I just wanted to kind of, again, those are words directly, you know, from our campuses. I think those really lay out, you know, our concerns with implementing them. Will they all stop offering Ed2Go courses if it's removed from the formula? I don't know. They might not. I realize that some of them were offering these courses prior to them, you know, prior to the outcomes-based funding formula, but this is definitely a concern to them. And I think, again, looking at what the intent is, making instruction available and getting people trained, and that's happening here, regardless of who's actually delivering it. They've just found a more effective way to do it.
Right. Thank you, Danny, and thank you for the comments from the institutions. As I mentioned to you previously, we do understand and recognize that making the suggestion is going to require our institutions, the community colleges, to have some pretty deep conversations about where they're going to invest their money. They're going to have financial conversations about how going forward they would make decisions about which courses to offer in partnership with Ed2Go. It is my understanding that every single one of these courses does charge a fee, and that students are paying those fees. And I believe that the institutions are receiving some funding for entering into these partnerships with Ed2Go. And we do understand that they will have to make decisions about what to focus on. That's not lost on us. But you know, we are dealing with a finite amount of funding through the funding formula, and specifically with this metric, are trying to make sure that the funding flows to institutions for activities that and ways that they have invested using their finite resources. And so, you know, the fact that that these institutions are not providing instructors and are not providing instructional material for these courses was something that did not feel to us to comport with the overall want of the workforce training metric. But
Okay.
we absolutely hear what you're saying about this. I would hope that institutions would continue to offer these, continue to partner with Ed2Go. We're not excluding that. We're not telling them they can no longer do that. They can continue to do that on their own. It's just funding will not move for those activities under this proposed change.
Okay, and I'll touch on the OSHA one, but before I go there, as I understand it, you all have a study committee or someone that's really going to be looking in more depth at workforce development, I guess, during this next 5-year cycle. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah, absolutely, Danny. As I mentioned in the introductory comments, and we've spoken to you in TBR about we over the next several years, well, at least for this year, but then in order to develop a new outcome, which is what we're thinking about, it will require at least 4 years of data in order to run that in the funding formula. So there will be a discussion about potentially identifying a better way to measure these partnerships within the funding formula with an eye towards the next 5-year review. Yes, sir.
Okay, so I guess with that, I mean, we would like to request or suggest that really any decision on Ed2Go be deferred until you have the bigger look at workforce development. I don't know that it's, and I don't know one way or the other, you may know, I don't know that it's distorting funding at this point. I mean, each of our community colleges have an opportunity to do this, et cetera, but that's just something that we would suggest is that maybe since you're going to take a larger look at workforce development, that this would just be deferred until then. So with regard to OSHA training, of course, this is impacting, Vol State, and we do recognize that Vol State is using really a somewhat unique model to deliver the workforce training at this point. And we do believe, as you know, that what Vol State is doing is then the current rules for the workforce contact hours. However, we do recognize that they are in fact doing so well that it's skewing the curve with regard to the workforce contact hours funding, and will likely continue to do that in the future as well if they continue on, at the current pace that they are. So I guess to that end, if a change needs to be made, then we would suggest that a scenario be looked at where maybe instead of eliminating the hours from the formula, that the hours be either scaled or capped, and maybe even that this training could become a secondary workforce outcome with maybe a different weight and different scale for what might seem like a runaway outcome, at this point. And again, we've discussed at length, and I'll not go over all that again on why, I think we think that in theory and philosophically that this does meet, the intent, but we do realize that there are concerns, and this probably was not what was contemplated, when the formula was developed early on, that something like this could happen and skew the results for other schools as well. So that's kind of our thoughts on the OSHA training.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Are there any other comments from committee members about this proposed change?
Thank you all. Thank you, Crystal.
Yep.
All right, so that ends our recommendations that we were intending to bring forward. I know that we will be fielding conversations and comments and questions on these going forward. I just want to give an opportunity for anyone to speak to anything that's been spoken about today or in our review at this moment. Are there any hands raised? Mm-hmm. Let's give another second. Okay. Well, again, our next steps are intended to continue this conversation, not in the meeting format, but to provide a memo with our recommendations and the modeling that's been requested and the data that's been requested over the next couple of months in preparation for our recommendation. Again, we are right now in the year 2021 and proposing changes for next year's cycle. We're butting up against a 2025 5-year review. So this 5-year review is going to be truncated as far as the cycle length of it, but with an opportunity to continue this conversation over the next few years.
More quickly.
More
than
quickly.
typically been the case.
More quickly than would have been the case. That said, we will send out the slides after the meeting and have minutes over the next few weeks as we compile, and appreciate any feedback in the interim. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of the week. Happy Labor Day weekend.